Hello and welcome to Learn English with JOJO, and today I am going to bring you 5 of my favorite podcasts and why I like them, and hopefully it will inspire you to listen to some podcasts in English so that you can improve your English listening skills. Or if you stumbled across this video and you already speak English fluently, they will just be interesting podcast recommendations. And in French, actually, I think when they say podcast, sometimes they mean a YouTuber who's a comedian who comes in front of the camera and does lots of sketches and then talks about a certain subject. Kind of like me, but actually funny. But that's not what I'm talking about when I say podcast. I'm talking about an audio podcast, so it's just for listening. It's just a radio broadcast that you can download and listen to wherever you are. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about podcasts, why I like them, and why they're good for learning languages, and then I will tell you my 5 podcasts, the list that I wrote down for today, and so I am obsessed with podcasts. I listen to them all the time. I probably listen to a good 3 hours of podcasts a day. And the reason I like them so much is because I can do dishes while listening to podcasts. I can go for a walk while listening to podcasts. I can clean my room while listening to podcasts. Basically anything that doesn't involve a lot of thought to it. So anything that is a little bit mindless. It makes chores go by very quickly, and it makes me even look forward to doing chores. I like doing the dishes. I know, it's strange. Podcasts are great for learning languages, especially if you already have an intermediate or advanced level of the language, because it's just straight immersion. And if you can follow the story, then you start to become involved in the story. You want to know more. There's great music going on in the podcast, and it's a very immersive experience in general. And so immersive experiences are what you're looking for when you're learning a new language. That's why I made a video about what TV series on Netflix to watch, because you have an extended period of time to immerse yourself. And I use French podcasts to learn French as well. And I only know one Spanish podcast, Radio Ambulante, that I listen to once in a while, but I'm not good enough in Spanish to really understand. I just let the words flow in my ears, and hopefully I pick up some language that way. So if you have any French podcast recommendations or Spanish podcast recommendations for me, I would love to hear them. So the first podcast is Serial, and this follows the case of Adnan Syed. He was charged for murdering someone, his ex-girlfriend. I forgot where. I think it was Pittsburgh or Baltimore. I think Baltimore. And this radio producer named Sarah Koenig interviews him a lot, gets his side of the story, does her own investigation, because he claims that he is not guilty, and she wants to get to the bottom of what is going on. And it's very interesting, and millions of people have listened to it, and it sparked this change in podcasts to be more popular, because before they were a pretty niche thing. So I recommend Serial if you haven't listened to it, and the first season in particular is the best season in my opinion. So the second podcast is actually by the same people that made Serial. It's called S-Town, which is the non-vulgar way of saying shit town. So a radio producer at This American Life, which is the third podcast recommendation that I will recommend to you, got an email from John B. McLemore in Woodstock, Alabama, so a very small town in Alabama, and basically John was writing to him to come down to Woodstock, or Shittown, Alabama, as he called it, and investigate a murder and corruption, and just basically to show what it's like living in a small town in Alabama and how they have very limited resources and they're very poor, and because of that, bad things happen. And so the radio producer from This American Life, Brian Reed, he goes down to Alabama to investigate, to meet John, and it turns into a story more about John than investigating the murder, and it is amazing. It is so good, so interesting to see, just have a glimpse into that place, that person's life, and I really recommend this podcast even more than Serial. It's a more literary podcast, so the language that they use is a little bit more poetic, in my opinion. So the third podcast I'd like to recommend is This American Life, and it's just each week or every 2 weeks, I can't remember, they bring you a story of American stories. So a story about Americans or American experience, and there's even stories about non-American things. Like there was a recent one about refugee camps in Greece. They went to Greece and they interviewed people in the refugee camps. Really interesting. It's been around for, I think, 20 years, and it's just a great podcast produced in Chicago, and it's very famous, very well produced, all around great podcast. The fourth one is Reply All. Now, Reply All is probably my favorite podcast. They talk about all things internet, but that's a really broad subject matter, so they get into very random stories, but amazing at the same time. One of my favorite recent ones is they just accepted calls from listeners for 48 straight hours, and they just answered people's calls no matter what, and it was just an interesting experiment. It's just a very experimental podcast, and that's why I love it. The fifth and final podcast to recommend to you today is Nancy. And Nancy is a new podcast, and it is about LGBTQ+. So it tells stories of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning, and plus, which means all the other stuff with gender and sexuality, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, asexual, demisexual, pansexual, all this stuff. So if you're at all interested in that, that's reason enough to listen to it. But I imagine even if you don't fall under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, you have a family member or friend who is. It's just a well-done podcast, and I really like it. There are only 13 episodes so far, and they interview random New Yorkers on the street sometimes, and they just tell interesting stories, and that's why I like it. Okay, that is it. If you have any recommendations for me for podcasts, please let me know in the comments, and I will probably make this video into a series because I have lots of podcasts to recommend because I love podcasts. I'm obsessed, and it would make me happy to let you know about them, to give you more recommendations. Maybe the ones I gave you today were not your style and you'd like to hear about other ones, or maybe you don't care, but I care, so that's why I'm making the video. It's partly for me. Okay, that's it.